This review is designed to help prepare for the Biology Keystone exam. This podcast will help prepare for questions 33 through 37 in your biology review packet. So what we need to talk about today is the overarching idea of evolution, which is one characteristic shared by every single organism. So what we need to do is just start with a basic definition. The idea of evolution is it's a process. It's a continuing process that's constantly occurring from which a new species develops from a species that previously exists. It's not as pretty and clear-cut as you would think with Pokemon, where you hit some certain change and you go from Bulbasaur to Ivysaur to Venusaur. It's a much more messy idea. What we really want to focus on here is these branch points, and it's the idea of a common ancestor. So the idea behind evolution is that all life ultimately began with one common ancestor. And what happened is there were points where groups split off. And they continue to split off, and we get much, much smaller groupings. So you can see here, this is a big split between bacteria and our two other domains of life. And here's where another type of bacteria called Archaeobacteria branched off. And then we have Eukarya, which from our second podcast is organisms that have a nucleus and organelles. And then you can see, as we go along, we had a common ancestor here, and we keep branching off and branching off and branching off. And then when we get to animals, there would be a common ancestor here that would take all the animal groups that you can think of, mammals and fish and reptiles, and they branch off, and you keep getting these common ancestors until you split to one specific species. Now, natural selection is really what drives the whole idea of evolution. And the idea is that certain organisms are better suited for their environment, and then they get to survive, and certain ones that aren't suited aren't. So here's just a really cute schematic. You can see here there's one different bird, and there is variation in a population. If you look to the person to your left of you and the person to your right of you, you probably have a different hair color or eye color or height. Maybe you have freckles and your partner doesn't. Maybe you have a widow's peak and your partner doesn't. It's more than just our physical characteristics. It's also what's going on in our bodies, the variations in our enzymes and our proteins and our structures. But for this sake, we'll make it simple and look at color. And you can see that certain traits get selected against and certain traits get selected for. And then you continually get variation through a population. And again, those traits that are better off get to survive. So, first thing we really need to think about is there are more species than resources can support. Typically, species have more offspring than will survive because they know that, it's a tough world out there. So you have lots of different ones. And so those species that are alive and those individual organisms, species have to compete with different species, and they have to compete with their own species. They have to compete for those resources. Are they getting enough food, enough shelter? Are they going to be able to survive predation? And we have that variation, which I showed you in the previous slide, was all those different colors. And those variations exist because we have those different alleles. We talked about genetics. Do you have a dominant trait? Do you have a recessive trait? Are you homozygous recessive, or are you heterozygous? All that stuff comes into play and makes you genetically different. If you have the right combinations of traits to survive in your environment, and the environment's always changing. Snow, rain, mountains, volcanoes, different people move in, human beings interact with the environment a lot. If an organism has the correct trait, then they're going to be able to survive. And really the goal is, if you can survive, you're going to try to reproduce. If you don't have the right traits, the right genes, the right alleles, then you're not going to survive and you're going to die. And what happens is, again, if you can survive, you make babies, you pass on, hopefully, your genetic material to the next generation. And as this continues over a very long course of time, many, many generations, hundreds of thousands of years, what happens is those changes, they continue to snowball and pile up on each other. And at some point, you have a clear distinction between these two groups, and you have a new species. So pictorially, it looks something like this. And what I want to stress here is this is incorrect. This is what a lot of people think. Evolution is an individual change. It's not like Pokemon. It's not one organism changing during the course of its lifetime. What we're looking at here is we have variation within a generation. I don't know what their certain environmental effect is that they have to overcome. I'm not worried about whether they're predators. I'm not worried about whether they're prey. But certain ones are selected against, and that's the ones with the X's, so they die out. Those that survive they get to reproduce. But again, you're not going to reproduce to be the exact same person. We have asexual reproduction where we have clones, but at least we as human beings, we go through sexual reproduction. And most higher organisms do. And when you go through sexual reproduction, you get that shuffling of traits. And you can see here, there's still variation. But again, certain traits are selected against. And this continues and continues, and given enough time, you get something that allows these organisms to have the right combination of genes to better survive in their environment. So this really happens through these ideas of isolating mechanisms. And the idea of an isolating mechanism is something that's going to allow different organisms to be separate from their main group. Because when they're cut off from their main group, then they aren't able to just interbreed and mix their genes and their genetic material with the main members of their population. So the idea of isolating mechanisms is how we get evolution to really occur, to the point where they can't interbreed anymore. So if I have 2 different types of squirrels in my backyard, okay, those squirrels could mate, they could make babies, so they are considered the same species. If I find 2 different true species of squirrels, they would not be able to reproduce to produce fertile offspring. Meaning maybe they could make babies, but their babies couldn't make babies. So if you can reproduce with another individual or another organism to make fertile offspring, then you're considered the same species. And we have geographic isolation. This is one of these ways we start to let these changes accumulate. This is one of the easier ones. Geographic, think geography. There's some sort of barrier here, and in this case we're looking at a river. I have an individual population, it gets split. The environment has changed on both sides of this river that forms, so you can see that given enough time, these changes accumulate, and they're physically different, but if we were to bring them back together, they would not be able to reproduce again. Temporal isolation. Again, this occurs over many generations of changes accumulating. So these are 3 different types of frogs. And what you're looking at here is what month they actually do their mating season. And if you look here, this month is February to March. Here I have April to kind of May, and over here I have September to November. These frogs are physically not fertile at the same time. So even if they were in the same room, they would not be able to reproduce because they are not fertile at the same time. And then we have behavioral isolation. And the idea behind behavioral isolation is that yes, technically you may be able to mate to produce offspring, but in the case of behavioral isolation, you would not find the other organism appealing at all. You would find them completely repulsive, so you would choose not to mate with them. So typically what happens is if you have one of these types of isolating mechanisms, it allows those changes to further accumulate and further accumulate. So even if you try to do everything right and put the organisms back geographically, they're not separated, you got them to be able to mate at the same time, and even from a behavioral standpoint, you did it in vitro instead of actually in the organisms, it's not really going to happen. So we have this one other idea, and when people think of evolution, you guys talked about it in class, you probably talked about Darwin, and you talked about the idea of the Galapagos Islands, and that's part of where he spent his journey, and the Galapagos Islands really helped him kind of see how evolution could occur. And the founder effect is a great idea behind this. And what happens is you have a big population in the founder effect. And for whatever reason, a small group, a small select number of individuals go off and they branch away from that main group to start a new area, whether it's by choice, maybe there's not enough food, maybe they're chased away by a predator, maybe it's just completely random. And what happens is that small set of genetic variation that's in the mini population basically controls what happens in the big population. And it's called the founder effect because they're kind of founding or finding a new area. So you can see here's an example with little ladybugs. Here I have about a 50-50 split between the 2 different colorations. So there's some genetic variation here. What happens is, in this case, it looks like they get blown from the mainland to a new island, and only a couple of red ones get carried over. So what happens is that yellow trait, that allele or that gene, is kind of lost from here. And what happens, again, given enough time, those changes are going to further and further accumulate. So there is a lot of evidence for evolution. It's still considered a theory by the scientific community because we don't ever really prove anything in science. We just find supporting evidence. And we're going to talk about some of these different kinds of pieces of supporting evidence. First one I want to talk about is the fossil record. And I choose this picture because I think it's really interesting looking at whales. Whales have hip bones, but whales clearly don't have legs. So it kind of shows us the idea of, if we look at the fossil record, we can see why whales have hip bones even though they don't swim. So you look back here, here's kind of one of my species of whales. They're showing you the jaws here, but if we were to look at the fossil record and we're able to kind of come up with a mini timeline, you can see all the way back here that this common ancestor over here that started branching into all these things that eventually became our whales and our dolphins today, there was a four-legged common ancestor. So it's showing kind of how those organisms do change over millions and millions of years. You can see here from 55 million years ago up to present is what they're showing you here. So these are the species that made to present, and these changes happened over millions of years. And also, by being able to date these fossils through carbon dating and other pieces of equipment that we have today, we can show that the Earth is actually old enough for these changes to be possible. During Darwin's time, the main belief was the Earth was only a couple thousand years old. And if that was true, there's no way that these changes could have taken place because these changes need a lot of time to happen. We also have something called homologous structures, and I like to focus on this prefix homo, which means same. In the case of homologous structures, these are, right here, same structures, but they have different functions. So we're looking at the bones. In your arm, you have your humerus up top, your radius, your ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Those are the bones that make up your arm. A horse has those exact same bones in it. Yes, they function a little bit differently. We grasp, horses run. You can see here of a bat. It has the same bones, but it's using for something else. They're using it for flying. They're using it for flying, but more in a modified way. Bats use it kind of more for gliding than flying. And your flipper here for swimming. Same structure, the same bones exist, but a different function. And the reason that we believe they have the same structure is that they shared a common ancestor. And what happened is, as those environments differed and as those variations built up, we are able to see that organisms change over time to get all of these organisms that are present. And on the flip side of homologous structures, we have analogous structures. And I like to think of the idea of analogy. So again, up here I can see these are homologous structures. They have the same bones. Insects, however, they also fly, but they have a completely different structure to do it. They don't have bones in there. They don't have feathers. They don't have skin folds. Insects are relying on a completely different type of protein. So this is not homologous. The idea here is that they don't share a common ancestor. However, they both have evolved or changed to fit the idea of being able to fly, to get into the air, to either get away from predators or to find a different sort of food. We also have embryology, and embryology is looking at the study of embryos, how organisms develop. So you can see here we have a human being, a bird, a reptile, and a fish. These organisms are very, very different once they are mature. But if you look at the embryos, they have tails. We as human beings, we clearly no longer have tails. And birds, some of them have tails, some of them don't, but it's not as prominent as the tail of a fish or a reptile. And gill slits. We as human beings, we do not have gills. We have lungs. However, in our embryonic stages, as we are developing, we have gill slits. And what that shows us is in our evolutionary past, and you can see all these organisms here, fish, salamander, tortoise, and up, all these organisms in the past had some sort of common ancestor that did have gills and did have a tail. And those are things that we don't need them in our adult mature stage, but that embryology is still there to link us to our prior ancestor. More recently, we've really focused on the idea of biochemistry as a way to very clearly show these evolutionary relationships. Prior to the biochemistry, we've always focused on, well, they both have legs, they both have fur. Here, what we're doing is we're actually looking at their macromolecules. So we talked about that way back in the first podcast, the carbs, the lipids, nucleic acids, and the protein. What they focus on mainly is looking either at the nucleic acid structure, so those A's, those T's, those C's, and G's, or in the case of these two diagrams, they're focusing on the amino acid sequence. So we are looking at, do they have the same amino acids and do they have them in the same order? So let's look at human beings because we are species centric, and we can see for this little part of hemoglobin, they are looking at just 4 building blocks, 4 amino acids: lysine, glutamine, histidine, isoleucine. If you look at a gorilla, we almost completely match, and if you look at a chimpanzee, we completely match here. That doesn't mean that chimpanzees are our great-grandparents or anything like that. What it means is that we shared a common ancestor with the chimpanzee the most recently. If we look down here at a zebra and a horse, if I want to compare them to a horse, I see the zebra is the closest. Again, it doesn't mean that zebras and horses are cousins or that horses came more recently than zebras. What it means is they have shared a common ancestor more recently than we have with a horse. Here's another one looking again at hemoglobin, and what they're showing you again is what they're looking at is the number of differences, and they're also showing you time. So a lamprey has 125 differences in this sequence compared to us. So if we look at that, that's the highest number of differences. They split off longer ago. It doesn't mean they're more primitive. It just means that our common ancestor, we were here, and then they went their way, and all this stuff went our way. Then if I come down here and I look at a frog, there is a common ancestor here. I can see the more recently that we shared a common ancestor, the fewer differences we have. And the longer ago we shared a common ancestor, the more differences we have. Everyone focuses on extinction. They say, oh my God, extinction killed the dinosaurs. Extinction is a terrible thing. But you have to think about the idea that there have been numerous extinctions. And some scientists looking at where things are going now, they think we're due for another mass extinction. And extinctions are important because they do allow new organisms to fill these niches, these little environmental roles where the old ones were. So this is just a picture of different types of mammals, and some of them are sketches and some of them are stuffed animals in museums. These were the types of animals that were around during the time of the dinosaurs. They are very small, kind of shrew-like animals. Most scientists speculate that if they had not died out, the dinosaurs, during their extinction, that mammals would not have exploded and become as widespread as we are today, which certainly means for us as human beings, we probably would not have evolved in the way that we are now. So extinction happens, whether it's some drastic catastrophe, as they believe for the dinosaurs, or it just happens because the species does no longer, those individuals, have the traits necessary to survive in an ever-changing environment. One final thing I want to talk about is the pace at which evolution occurs. There are 2 main schools of thought on this. From a pictorial standpoint, you can see here punctuated equilibrium shows there's no change, there's no change, there's no change, and then there's a sudden evolutionary change. No change, no change, no change, and there's a sudden evolutionary change over here as well. And there was some drastic change where the 2 populations went completely divergent. Whereas gradualism shows this idea that little bit of a change over time, little bit of change over time, little bit of change over time. And there are different cases that we've seen that seem to support both of these ideas. There's also artificial selection, and this is something we as human beings have been doing for thousands of years. And we're basically saying, okay, we're not going to let nature decide. I want this in my crops. I want this in my livestock, so I'm going to figure out how I do it. The first idea is selective breeding. I have 2 parents that have traits that I really, really want, and they're both of the same species, and I want to breed them together to try to share those traits. An interesting example is all of these different vegetables come from wild mustard, and what's happened is they selectively bred. They notice that, ooh, I really like this one, it's got big leaves, so I'm going to breed this one that has big leaves with another plant that has big leaves. Keep doing this enough generations, there's your kale. If I want to focus on, oh, well, this one's got really nice stems and really nice flowers, that's where broccoli came from. Oh, this one has, a really, really big stem and a nice root system, there's my kohlrabi. Inbreeding is focusing on the family. So purebred animals are a great example of this. The reason they're purebred is they're often bred in that same family line to concentrate those traits. However, inbreeding does have sometimes some negative consequences with it. And then we have hybridization, the idea that you can breed together two completely different animals or two different parents to get the best of both worlds. A mule is an example. This is also broccoflower, This is broccoflower, which is resulting from crossing broccoli and cauliflower together. Oftentimes, the products of hybridization aren't they're sterile. They can't produce their own babies, so we wouldn't really say it's a new species being formed. But for the long run, we're getting the best of both worlds. So for evolution, it's a process that occurs in all organisms. It's one of these unifying traits of life. We have variations that lead to adaptations, and those adaptations can lead to survival. Also, there are negative variations, and that leads to organisms no longer passing on their traits. There's a bunch of different type of evidence to support this theory of evolution. And we also have artificial selection to take into account changes for us, not so much for nature.